Yeah, this is a real scene from a real anime. So is this, and this, and this, and this. Every single one of those weirdly endearing atrocities are real, and those crimes against the eye all have the same culprit. Studio GoHands, also known as Studio Ufotable's crackhead cousin, also known as Studio Who Thought This Was a Good Idea, also known as Studio What the F am I Looking At? Studio GoHands. This video is all about them, their history, the way their productions work, how stuff like this came to be, who works on these things, why, just in general why, and more. Make sure to subscribe. Picture this for a second. The year is 2021. A younger me, I guess it's not that far back, so younger isn't the right word. A happier me is looking for a new show to watch. Back then I would binge watch a new show every day. The lockdown helped with that. Put the filter back on. While looking, I stumbled onto a show with a peculiar title. K, that's all the show was called, the letter K. It looked interesting, so I decided to check it out, and I was pleasantly surprised. Keep in mind, while I was interested in the production side of anime back then, I knew a lot less about it, and so to my naive eyes, the show looked incredible. It was unlike anything I had ever seen before, and I had seen a lot even back then. The K project was of course a Studio GoHands work, one of their earlier ones, and it took me by surprise. The general aesthetic, the dynamic storyboards, the strong action animation, it was amazing. In fact, to this day, I think the K project looked incredibly cool. I'll gladly die on that hill. Anyway, back to the flashback. I wasn't smart enough back then to look up staff names, so I simply enjoyed the show and moved on. I was aware of the name GoHands, but I didn't know much about them. I did watch Seitokai Yakuindomo at some point, and I did notice the occasional cool looking shot from it, but I didn't think much of it. Also, I was lucky enough to not stumble upon the violation of the Geneva Convention, that was handshakers. Fast forward to 2023, a show called The Girl I Like Forgot Her Glasses drops its first trailer. I check it out, and here's a faithful recreation of my first reaction to it. What the f? I was caught off guard. Everything about the show and about the Masterful Cat is Depressed Again, another GoHands show that aired alongside the Glasses anime, looked like a fever dream. I had so many questions. Why would anyone do this? Is this a social experiment? Are the creators being held hostage and this is their way of asking for help? What's happening? Well, as it turns out, stuff like this is simply what the studio does. Believe it or not, all of this is by choice. Now, before we talk about GoHands as it is right now, we need to talk about GoHands from the days gone by. Their supervillain origin story, if you will. Some of this video is based on a Sakuga blog article. I'll link it down in the description, check it out. The year is 2008. The world is going through a financial crisis. Beijing is hosting the Olympics. I am 4 years old. And Studio Satellite just finished producing the anime Marcos Frontier. One of those things is relevant to this video, guess which one? That's right, the Beijing Olympics. Look at them go. Jokes aside, the production of Marcos Frontier was accompanied by a mass departure of talent from Studio Satellite, a fairly common occurrence in the anime industry. The ex-Satellite staff then went on to create 2 anime studios. Staff from Satellite Studio 1 created 8-Bit, that's the company behind Slime Isekai, Blue Lock, and more, while staff from Satellite Studio 2 and Satellite's Osaka sub-studio created, you guessed it, GoHands. And that's how this studio came to be, in a manner that's fairly typical in the anime industry. But one question remains, were they always like this? Do all of their shows resemble the visual vomit aesthetic the modern version of the studio seems to be enamored with? Well, short answer, no. Their debut project, Princess Lover, actually looked great, conventionally great that is. Now, I'll be honest, I have not seen the show, but I have seen a bunch of clips from it, and it looked very impressive visually speaking. The staff list featured studio regulars like Hiroshi Okubo as well as guests like Norio Matsumoto and Kenichi Kutsuna. Another GoHands show from that time, the aforementioned Seitokai Yakuindomo, also looked conventionally great, and it too featured a bunch of major names. Tatsuya Yoshihara, Yoshimichi Kameda, and Shingo Yamashita, for example. Yes, this was 2010, but still the studio was clearly attractive to major talent back then. Besides that, the company had a closely knit group of core staff. Pretty much everyone who worked with the studio back then Japan are still involved with it to this day, and that's a great thing. The same can be said for ufotable, and look how good their output is. GoHands has 4 main directors: Hiromitsu Kanazawa, Katsumasa Yokomine, Shingo Suzuki, and Susumu Kudo. Every single GoHands anime ever is directed by some combination of these 4 names, 3 now because Kanazawa left the studio back in 2021, and 2 for a bit because Susumu Kudo took a hiatus from the studio following Coppelion, but he returned recently and it looks like he's here to stay. Also worth mentioning, Shingo Suzuki, unlike the rest, is a bit of a one-man army. Besides being a prominent director, he often pitches in as a character designer and an animator, making him one of the most valuable assets of the studio. Over on the animation side of things, Takayuki Uchida, Makoto Furuta, and Hiroshi Okubo are the 3 main names. Uchida and Furuta often handle important animation direction work, while Okubo is more of a highlight animator. All of these, by the way, are competent names, and back in the day, it seemed like GoHands had all the pieces that they were destined for success. But as we all know, things changed dramatically. GoHands over the years morphed into something unrecognizable, and I know what you're thinking. When did it all go wrong? When did this turn into this? Well, it wasn't a sudden thing, it was gradual. Earlier projects like Murdoch's Scramble and the aforementioned K-series were very much GoHands-like, but they were fun to watch. They looked good. I believe experimental is the correct word. These projects were rough around the edges, but they were fun to watch, unironically so. Shows like K leaned heavily into the digital side of anime production. They made heavy use of 3D components and compositing tricks, and as a result, the final product looked very processed and computerized, for lack of a better term. Besides that, they were directed and storyboarded in an unorthodox manner. The team relied heavily on 3D-aided dynamic camera work and warped shot compositions, but again, that wasn't a sudden development. GoHands projects always had a fondness for volumetric, 3-dimensional shots, and this fondness was usually realized by in-house ace animator Hiroshi Okubo. He animated a bunch of hyperdynamic shots for the studio. Basically, even the earliest GoHands projects featured some degree of dynamic storyboards, and because of these factors, the digital aesthetic and the warped shot compositions, the GoHands from that K project era gave off an experimental vibe. They resembled early ufotable, although the latter was a lot more competent on a technical level. The shows produced by GoHands back in the day looked interestingly different. Unfortunately, the studio saw that and went, you know what would be really f***ing funny? What if we made our shows unwatchable? What if we made a show that no one can sit through without suffering an epileptic attack? Could you imagine kids having seizures? That would shake things up. I believe that's how the pitch meeting for Handshakers went down. Handshakers was a crime against humanity. Full disclosure, I haven't seen the whole thing, I've seen parts. Now, should I have watched the entire thing as part of the research for this video? Yes, but here's the thing. I love making content, I really enjoy making videos, but there are certain sacrifices I'm not willing to make, and watching Handshakers is one of them. Based on what I have seen, Handshakers was an absolute nightmare. It was a highlight reel of the very worst of digital processing and CGI integration. The 3D rendering/textures looked horrendous, the digital effects were god-awful, the designs were so absurdly detailed they made the animation fall apart, and the storyboards were genuinely nauseating. Handshakers was a disaster, no doubt about it, but why did that happen? What changed? Why did the studio go from the experimentally endearing K project to the horror beyond human comprehension that was Handshakers and Project Scarred? Did the studio undergo a major staff overhaul? Did the behind-the-scenes situation fall apart? Was the change in style caused by a new staff member, kinda like Ufotable's Yuichi Terao? No, no, and no. The core staff at the studio has remained the same since the start. If anything, their productions have relied less on outside talent over the years. The studio is home to some of the most well-planned and healthy productions out there, and not every GoHands anime has the same director of photography and CGI director. It's not a talent thing, and it's not a time thing. The way GoHands shows look is the way the team wants them to look. This is the vision. Why? I have no idea, your guess is as good as mine. In his article, Kevin cites the desire to stand out and have a quirk as the reason behind the studio's output, but I have a hard time buying that. GoHands, in more ways than one, is the ideal studio. Not only do their projects boast an absurd amount of animation power, the production conditions at the studio are some of the best in the industry. The shows produced by the studio are given ample time and often finished before they start airing. The studio also boasts a strong in-house culture. Here's a fun activity. Take your favorite show, look it up on Anime News Network, scroll down to the Japanese company section, and look at the amount of studios involved with the project. Regardless of how good the show looks, you'll see a bunch of companies involved with various aspects, be it in between animation or photography. Now do the same thing for Momentary Lily, the most recent GoHands project. Actually, you don't need to, I did that already. There's not a single company outside of GoHands themselves credited, meaning yes, the show in its entirety is produced in-house. That is unheard of. From major roles like direction and key animation to minor ones like in-between animation and paint, GoHands does everything. Back to my original point, in my opinion, all of that alone is enough to stand out to production committees. And if it's not, sacrificing some of those amenities in favor of efficiency definitely is. Making this isn't necessary. I don't think GoHands is a case of a manufactured quirk gone wrong. I think it's a case of ambition gone wrong. I genuinely believe GoHands makes anime with the intention of entertaining. I believe their aim is to win over fans, not producers. They do what they do because they believe in it, not because they want to stand out. I genuinely think that. Throughout this video, I made multiple parallels between GoHands and ufotable, and that's for a reason. The two companies are more similar than you think. Both got their start producing conventional high-quality shows. Both made a pivot towards a more digital style. Both make heavy use of 3D components and compositing. Both have a strong in-house culture. Both produce shows with healthy production conditions. Both have their own unique style. They are very similar. Ufotable, however, pulled the brakes at the right time. The Ufotable digital team mastered one thing before moving on to the next, while GoHands adopted every digital technique they could get their hands on all at once. They had no regard for cohesion or harmony. In fact, at times it felt like they went out of their way to make sure their shows weren't cohesive and well put together. Like, what do you mean you want your backgrounds to look photorealistic all the time? That's a disaster waiting to happen. The more recent GoHands projects do look better. They look less lost, and in some rare cases, a shot or two actually ends up looking good. Despite that, the usual problems remain. The designs are so detailed, especially around the hair, that it looks unappealing and cripples the animation. The aesthetic, besides being overly digital, looks sterilized and overly polished. The storyboards have gotten better. We don't see the camera no clipping through the floor anymore, but they are still distracting, and this entire approach leads to all sorts of issues. Be it the abhorrent amounts of melt or janky in-betweens, be it the concept of color design losing all meaning due to over-digitization, or horrendously ugly 3D background work. Basically, I would not refer to anything GoHands has produced since K Project as good looking. So, do I wish they didn't exist? Do I want the talented animators at GoHands to work on more normal looking projects? I don't. Many do, including many in the actual industry, but I don't. Yes, I don't like GoHands' output. I am entertained by it, but I don't like it. But despite that, I'm glad they exist. I firmly believe that there's no such thing as an objectively good or bad piece of art. In my mind, what GoHands does is simply creative. Horrendously executed in my opinion, but creative nonetheless. Saying GoHands' animation power would be better used elsewhere is almost like saying the animation power of an obscure good-looking anime would be better used on insert popular battle shonen here. I despise that mindset. The idea that talent must congregate around major IPs is selfish, counterproductive, and most importantly, profoundly stupid. And that logic also applies to this topic. It's not about GoHands' output looking good or bad, it's about the concept of a company like GoHands existing, and I think they have every right to. Setting aside the perverse sense of enjoyment I derive from their projects, I think it's good that a company pushes the boat that far, even if that leads to a scenario where a character uses literal telekinesis to move a chair because the processing was too much for the compositing artist, or one where the company has to reuse assets across multiple shows. The anime industry is home to into a wide range of styles, and to me, that GoHands look is one of them. I personally would much rather live in a world where they exist than one where they don't. And hey, maybe 10 years from now, they'll polish their style enough for their output to be considered good looking. Maybe. One last thing, I didn't bring up that whole plagiarism controversy surrounding the studio. I felt like it wasn't relevant to the topic, but you can look it up on your end if you want. And that's about it. Liked the video? Check out this other bit of content on screen, like and subscribe, and until next time.